The trijet era was one of the most interesting periods in commercial aviation, and it has not returned. 3 engines, 2 under the wings and 1 in the tail, was a configuration that existed for a very specific window of time, when twin-engine jets were not yet trusted on long overwater routes, when 4-engine jets were simply more aircraft than most routes needed, and when the aerodynamic and certification landscape of the day made a middle path feel like the obvious answer. That window opened in 1964 when the Boeing 727 entered service. It closed in 2014 when KLM flew the last scheduled passenger flight on the MD-11 from Montreal to Amsterdam. 50 years of trijets, and then nothing. Maybe that is a good thing. The 3 main trijets each ended in their own way. The DC-10 was a mechanical disaster, full stop, no need to revisit it here. The L-1011 TriStar was, by most engineering assessments, at least 20 years ahead of the DC-10 in sophistication. It was arguably the finest wide-body jet of its generation. It also destroyed Lockheed's commercial aircraft division. By 1984, Lockheed had sold 250 aircraft against the 500 it needed to break even, walked away from commercial aviation entirely, and never came back. And the Boeing 727, the aircraft that started the trijet conversation and was, in pure sales terms, the most successful of the 3, aged out of scheduled service through the 1990s and early 2000s, quietly replaced by the 737 family it had helped inspire. 3 different trijets, 3 different endings, all of them final. After the DC-10 production line shut down in December 1988, McDonnell Douglas was left with a decision most companies in their position would not have had the nerve to make. The DC-10 name was damaged. The widebody program had never broken even. Boeing and Airbus were both moving toward new, clean-sheet aircraft that McDonnell Douglas had no answer to. The logical move was to start over with something genuinely new. McDonnell Douglas did not have the money to start over, so they did the next thing. They decided to build something that looked new enough, cost far less to develop, and carried just enough promise to bring airlines back to the table. That aircraft was the MD-11. McDonnell Douglas had actually been studying DC-10 derivatives since 1976, before the DC-10 had even produced its worst years. The internal program ran through a sequence of names that tells its own story about how many times the scope was reset and the ambitions scaled back. DC-10 Super 50, then Super 60, then MDEE, which stood for Efficiency, Economics, and Extended Range, then MD-100, and finally MD-11 from 1984 onward. Each rename was another round of budget conversations and internal arguments about what the aircraft genuinely needed to be versus what the company could realistically afford. The MD prefix itself was the clearest signal of those conversations. McDonnell Douglas had spent the early 1980s successfully rebranding its DC-9 derivative as the MD-80, partly because it was a better aircraft and partly because putting distance between a new product and the DC name helped in airline sales rooms. The same logic applied here. The mid-1980s were, briefly, not a bad time for McDonnell Douglas. The MD-80 was selling at 10 aircraft a month in 1987. Military contracts were healthy. Jim Worsham, who had arrived from General Electric in 1982 to run Douglas aircraft and had been given much of the credit for the turnaround, had reason to feel the company was on solid ground. The problem was the horizon. Boeing was developing what would become the 777. Airbus was building the A330 and A340 at the same time. Both of those programs needed the kind of sustained investment that McDonnell Douglas could not match. By the time John F. McDonnell, son of the company's founder James McDonnell, became chief executive in 1988, the company's long-term debt had tripled since 1986, reaching $3.3 billion. A clean-sheet widebody was not a conversation that debt level allowed. So what was available was the DC-10's tooling, its certification basis, its supply chain, and a decade of hard-won knowledge about exactly where the aircraft had fallen short. In late 1986, the board formally launched the MD-11 with commitments for 92 aircraft from 12 airlines. And then the board made the decision that would define everything that followed. They refused to fund an entirely new wing. A new wing, designed around mid-1980s aerodynamic understanding rather than early 1970s, would have given the MD-11 the fuel burn efficiency it needed to actually deliver on the range figures the sales team was about to promise airlines. It would also have cost several $100 million the board was not prepared to spend. Instead, engineers took the DC-10's existing wing, added winglets that McDonnell Douglas had been developing with NASA since wind tunnel tests in 1978 and 1979, and worked with what they had. The winglets improved fuel efficiency by around 2.5%. The engineers knew that was not enough. The board launched the program anyway. There was one moment in 1987 when the wing problem nearly got solved by a different route entirely. Jim Worsham opened a series of conversations with Airbus executives about a technical collaboration. The specific idea was to mount an A330 wing, which Airbus was designing from scratch with the advanced aerodynamics McDonnell Douglas could not afford to develop, onto the MD-11 fuselage. The hybrid aircraft was discussed internally under the name AM300, and it would have fixed the range problem before the first aircraft was ever built. Those talks collapsed. The reasons were commercial, competitive, and thoroughly political. McDonnell Douglas was simultaneously and publicly accusing Airbus of receiving illegal government subsidies from European governments, which made a close engineering partnership somewhere between awkward and impossible to sustain in front of shareholders and regulators. Worsham went back to Long Beach, the AM300 stayed on paper, and the program moved forward with a wing that everybody in the building already knew was a compromise. By the way, if you're into stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming. Assembly of the first MD-11 prototype began at the Douglas Products Division in Long Beach on the 9th of March, 1988. The fuselage sections were built by General Dynamics' Convair division in San Diego, the same facility that had been building DC-10 fuselage sections for years, and moved by barge to Long Beach, then by truck to the final assembly hall. The nose came from the McDonnell Douglas facility in St. Louis. The wings were manufactured in Malton, Ontario. Control surfaces came from Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was a genuinely global supply chain which kept development costs manageable but spread manufacturing oversight thin enough that quality problems were slower to surface than anyone needed. What came out of that process was, on paper, a serious step forward. The fuselage was stretched 11% to 202 feet, fitting 298 passengers in a 3-class layout. Maximum takeoff weight was 630,500 pounds, 14% higher than the DC-10-30. The flight deck had 6 interchangeable CRT screens running Honeywell VIA 2000 computers, and the whole thing required only a captain and a first officer. No flight engineer. Engine choices were the General Electric CF6-80C2 or the Pratt & Whitney PW4000, both significantly more fuel efficient than anything the DC-10 had used. The MD-11 is worth a moment because it was not an accident. MD stood for McDonnell Douglas, a deliberate departure from the DC lineage that Donald Douglas had established back in the 1930s. When McDonnell Aircraft merged with Douglas in 1967, the combined company had kept the DC designation for existing programs, but the MD-80's commercial success in the early 1980s had established the new convention. The 11 was simply the next available number in the product sequence, nothing more to it than that. It communicated newness, distance from DC-10 history, and membership in a product family that airlines had recently had positive experiences with. Pilots and ground crews gave it their own name, as they always do. The MD prefix across the whole family had generated the nickname Mad Dog by the late 1980s, rhyming slang born somewhere in pilot culture, informal and a little affectionate, applied to everything from the MD-80 to the MD-11. In cockpits, it was the Mad Dog. In the departure lounge, it was whatever was painted on the tail, because most passengers had no idea what type they were boarding. The first flight was originally scheduled for March 1989. Manufacturing issues, supplier delays, and a labor dispute at Long Beach pushed the rollout to September 1989, and the maiden flight finally happened on the 10th of January 1990, with Chief Test Pilot Thomas Cleaver at the controls. Testing then confirmed what the engineers had privately suspected for some time. At full payload of 28,000 kilograms, real-world range came in around 230 nautical miles short of the stated specification. To reach the advertised 7,130 nautical miles, payload had to be cut by more than 20%, down to roughly 22,000 kilograms. McDonnell Douglas documented the shortfall internally, launched a performance improvement program to try to close the gap through aerodynamic and software modifications, and then delivered the first aircraft to airlines while that program was still in progress. Singapore Airlines canceled its order for 20 MD-11s in August 1991, 8 months after the aircraft entered service. The stated reason was performance shortfall. The MD-11 could not carry a viable commercial load on the trans-Pacific routes Singapore had bought it to fly. The order transferred to Airbus, which received a contract for 30 A340-300s. American Airlines had originally ordered 50 MD-11s. It took delivery of 19 and operated them for less than 8 years. McDonnell Douglas understood what was happening and tried twice to respond, and both times it did not work. In 1991, the board approved the MD-12, a double-deck, four-engine aircraft intended to compete with the Boeing 747 on high-density long-haul routes, backed by a partnership in which Taiwan Aerospace acquired a 40% stake. No airline placed a firm order. Taiwan Aerospace pulled out. The program closed without a prototype. Then, at the 1996 Farnborough International Air Show, the company presented the MD-XX, a further stretched MD-11 derivative in 2 configurations, one seating 375 passengers, one with extended range. Harry Stonecipher, the company president, told analysts afterwards that the board could have launched the MD-XX on 40 to 50 orders from 5 or 6 airlines, and that was not why they had canceled it. The real reason was that Douglas's share of new commercial aircraft orders had fallen to barely double digits. Boeing held 60% of the global market. The estimated cost of competing as an equal with Boeing and Airbus over the following decade was $15 billion. The board canceled the MD-XX in October 1996. 3 months later, McDonnell Douglas and Boeing announced a merger. On the 1st of August 1997, Boeing completed the acquisition for $13 billion in stock. And there was no commercial interest in keeping a production line open for an aircraft that undercut its own products. In June 1998, Boeing announced that MD-11 production would end when the remaining order backlog was filled. The last passenger MD-11, delivered to Sabena, left the line in April 1998. The last 2 aircraft ever built were freighters for Lufthansa Cargo, delivered on the 25th of January and the 22nd of February 2001. Total production? 200 aircraft, against a company projection of more than 300.